Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics 111. We're going to talk about the government agency that actually carries out monetary policy. Unlike fiscal policy, which is carried out by Congress and the President using government spending and taxing, monetary policy is carried out by an organization called the Federal Reserve. If you notice, your money has both the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve stamped on it. On the top of every bill is noted a Federal Reserve note. This is the government agency responsible for monetary policy. They're going to decide what the quantity of money is and as a result determine interest rates in the economy, which they'll use to either fight inflation or promote growth to fight a recession. The organization, surprisingly, is privately owned. And so private banks own shares in the Federal Reserve. But it's supposed to be used for the benefit of the public. So it's considered quasi-public and quasi-private. There are three parts to the Federal Reserve: the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve Banks, and the Federal Open Market Committee. For our purposes, the Federal Open Market Committee is going to be very important because this is the organization that actually buys and sells bonds to affect changes in the supply of money and change interest rates. The Board of Directors is the central authority for money and banking in the United States. It sets monetary policy, which will then be executed by the Federal Open Market Committee. The President, with consent of the Senate, appoints and approves its members. There are 7 members with 14-year terms, and one of those will be the chairman. It's Jerome Powell right now. He was appointed by Donald Trump. All right. Now, the head of the Board of Governors also gets to be on the Federal Open Market Committees. There are 7 members of the Board of Governors and 5 of the presidents of the Federal Reserve Banks. These guys are going to be executing monetary policy. They direct the purchase and sale of government securities, which controls the money supply. Finally, there are Federal Reserve Banks. There are 12 of them in the nation. So the country is divided into 12 pieces, and they are quasi-public. It's a blend of government and private ownership. The Federal Reserve Banks are owned by commercial banks in each district by the purchase of stock in the Federal Reserve Board. But the commercial bank owners do not set policy, the Board of Governors does. Despite private ownership, the Federal banks are meant to promote public well-being. Why are there 12 of them? Well, the idea was that our country is so large, it could be possible that you would want expansionary monetary policy in New York, but contractionary monetary policy in California. So it allows monetary policy to be more in alignment with local regional conditions. The Federal Reserve is considered the banker's bank. So if the bank has money that it is not using, it can deposit it in the Federal Reserve Banks. Also, some of the money that banks have to be kept on deposit in reserve, in effect. And that percentage that banks cannot loan out is called is a reserve requirement, and that is set by the Federal Reserve, and they can deposit those reserves in the Federal Reserve Bank. The purpose of the Federal Reserve is to issue currency, set amount that banks cannot lend out, the reserve requirement, a tool that we're going to use to see how the Federal Reserve can adjust the supply of money and the resulting interest rate. They can lend money to banks at a rate called the discount rate. So if banks don't have enough money in the vault to meet the reserve requirements, they can borrow it at the discount rate. They control the money supply primarily through open market operations, which we're going to study, the buying and selling of government securities. They clear checks. So if you look at your bank statements and you have copies of the checks on the back, there'll be a long number scrolled over all of the cleared checks, and that work is done by the Federal Reserve. It manages the government's money and supervises the responsible management of banks, making sure their books are sound. So there's bank examinations. The Federal Reserve, the government organization in charge of monetary policy. We're specifically interested in the Federal Open Market Committee.